widespread, essentially sympathetic response. The adrenal medulla is secreting adrenaline, which is epinephrine, as a hormone. And so everywhere in the body where that epinephrine finds epinephrine receptors, alpha receptors or beta receptors, it is going to affect those muscles, those organs, those glands, those tissues. All right. Now, the other side of that coin is something called rest and digest. Now, we do not have a gland that secretes acetylcholine as a hormone. But if we have high levels of activity in our parasympathetic nerves, we're going to have widespread distribution of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter for the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Boy, that's a lot to remember. All right, so acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter here, and if the parasympathetic nerves are widely active, then we're going to get a lot of acetylcholine effects on our muscles, our nerves, our muscles, our tissues, our organs, and our glands. And the overall combination of activity is called the rest and digest system, or the rest and digest activity, or the rest and digest thingy. It's a highly technical term. You have to use that with care, thingy. All right. So what we would see is an increase in the motility of the small and large intestines. We would see a decrease in blood flow to the skeletal muscle. But an increase in blood flow through the skin and the visceral organs. In other words, pretty much the opposite of what we were seeing with fight or flight. We would see a decrease in blood pressure, the pupils are going to constrict. There's going to be a decrease in the person's respiration rate. We'll see increased activity in the salivary glands, and the lacrimal glands. Now, you guys know what the salivary glands are, right? What do the salivary glands secrete? Saliva, yeah. I'm trying to make eye contact with you. Does anybody know what the lacrimal glands are? Well, they're not the ducts. They're the glands that produce the tears, right? So these would both be more active. So you're going to have nice moist eyes and a nice moist mouth. Moist. So these are all activities that would be part of the physiology when a person's not particularly anxious, when they're not worried, they're in a pleasant frame of mind, they're calm, they're physically not terribly active. So aside from the fact that you're all terrorized about your final exams, kind of like now. You're just kind of sitting here, going with the flow, letting it all just kind of wash over you. So these are probably things that are going on right now. Your parasympathetic nerves are active. They are secreting or using a lot of acetylcholine, and all of these events are occurring. Now, interestingly enough, also part of the parasympathetic control, and usually listed as part of the rest and digest system, is erection of the erectile tissues of the penis, the clitoris, and the nipples. So when we say in a pleasant frame of mind, we can kind of stretch that out a little bit further and take that into a little more extreme, sort of not just pleasant, but thinking happy thoughts. All right. So that pretty much covers the autonomic nervous system. Talked about the dual innervation. We talked about the locations of the ganglia. We talked about the neurotransmitters. We talked about the neurotransmitter receptors. And we talked about these two kind of system-wide or body-wide sets of effects. All right. Questions? Problems? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
What secretes epinephrine for fight or flight?
Epinephrine also is the same substance as adrenaline.
Yeah, but what secretes?
The adrenal gland.
Oh, adrenal medulla or?
Adrenal medulla.
Okay. And then the epinephrine is triggered by this.
Secretion from the adrenal medulla is triggered by?
Oh wait, no, never mind.
Fight or flight. What are the triggers?
Stress.
Fear, stress, anxiety,
Violence.
danger, or the perception that you are in danger.
And the rest and digest is from the parasympathetic?
Parasympathetic nerves.
Okay. And it increases acetylcholine?
That's what I said.
Okay.
All right. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. Somewhat new topic. So the next thing I want to talk to you guys about are reflexes. Now, a lot of people misuse the term reflex. On the evenings when we've been here until 9 or 9:30 at night, well, I'm here till 9:30. You guys are probably pretty much scattered. Since my car's the last one in the parking lot, you guys have obviously stampeded out of here a lot faster than I do.
Are you the last one out of this building?
Yeah. Sometimes the janitor is still here, but many times she's already gone. So yes, some nights, I shouldn't be telling you guys that because now I'm going to get mugged, but.
I was just about to ask, how much money do you carry on you?
Probably enough to make it worth somebody's while to do it, yeah, but, yeah. All right, so leaving here after dark, it's kind of creepy, it's kind of spooky. You're driving home, country roads, County Road 44, there's no lights, it's dark, you're driving along, and all of a sudden, a deer runs out into the road right in front of you. You don't see it until it's in your headlights. You slam on the brakes, you swerve around, because you know if you hit that deer, you and the car are going to be totaled, right? So is the deer, but you're not really all that worried about the deer, you're more worried about your car. All right, so, and then people will tell the story the next day, they're like, oh, I was going home last night, and this deer just ran out in front of me, and if I hadn't had great reflexes and slammed on those brakes, I would have been dead. Well, use of the word reflex here is not really scientifically accurate. obviously they responded very quickly and probably without thinking too hard about what they needed to do. But to really qualify as a reflex, it should be a rapid, predictable response to a stimulus. So far, so good. Deer in the headlights. However, it must be unlearned, and that's where it falls apart. Because, of course, someone had to teach you how to drive a car, and someone had to teach you what to do in case something unexpected happened while you were driving the car. See something you weren't expecting, touch the brakes, slow down, come to a stop. That's what you're supposed to do. Someone taught you that. And reflexes are unlearned. They cannot be taught. They are also involuntary. And let's face it, you had a microsecond there where you could have just gone ahead and hit the deer. Venison, yummy. All right, I got that smoker out back. It's time to load that guy up. Believe me, people do that. And 3, it should be not premeditated. Those people with the spotter lights on the top of their truck, that's premeditated. They're out there in the dark cruise around looking to hit a deer.
So
What was I supposed to do, officer? It just ran right out in front of me after I had shown them the spotter lights. Right. So what was the question? I'm
So
sorry.
the gag then is an actual reflex then, right? Your gag
The
reflex?
gagging, yes. That is part of your choking response, yes. All right. So to qualify as a reflex, it should be unlearned, involuntary, and not premeditated. Reflexes, in the anatomical and physiological definition, are essentially hardwired into our nervous systems. They're built into the structure of your brain, your spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system. So let's start by taking a look at the wiring. Now in the lab, you guys were studying the cranial nerves, and we do have reflexes that run through the brain and the cranial nerves, but the simplest ones to talk about are the ones that run through the spinal nerves. I was checking to make sure I had that right side up, right? So you guys kind of remember the vertebra, where there was that big hole in the vertebra, the vertebral foramen? Well, running through that vertebral foramen is your spinal cord. And projecting out from the spinal cord, really kind of between every pair of vertebra, is a spinal nerve. So, say for example, between the third thoracic vertebra and the 4th thoracic vertebra, we have the 3rd thoracic spinal nerve, one on each side. Right. Let's get a little bit closer. So you have cervical spinal nerves, and you have thoracic spinal nerves, and you have lumbar spinal nerves. And you guys remember the sacral foramen, those big holes in the sacrum? There's sacral nerves that stick out through those, and we got lots and lots of nerves. All right, so get in here a little bit closer to see how this works. All right. So here's the body of the vertebra, and here's the spinous process and the transverse processes, and here is the vertebral foramen. And in life, what we would find in here would be the spinal cord, a little bit of buffering from cerebrospinal fluid, some fat, and some membranes, the meninges. And so here you see the spinal cord, and connected to it are the spinal nerves. Now, all of the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They have a sensory component, they have sensory neurons, sensory axons, and they have motor neurons, motor axons. So there are action potentials coming in to the spinal cord, and there are action potentials going out from the spinal cord. Sensory information is coming in, motor commands are going out. I'm trying to find you the biggest picture I've got. So let's take away all the bone and fat and meninges, and here we have a little bit closer up view. Right. The spinal nerve, further away from the spinal cord, is all those axons are bundled together. But as we come in close to the spinal cord itself, what we see is that the sensory axons are going to split off from the motor axons. The sensory neurons are going to come around to the back of the spinal cord and attach to the spinal cord on the dorsal side. So this branch of the spinal nerve is called the dorsal root. The motor neurons are going to originate here in the spinal cord, and then their axons are going to exit the spinal cord on the ventral side, the anterior side. So this branch is called the ventral root. So sensory information is coming in through the dorsal root. Action potentials to control muscles or glands are going out through the ventral root. Now, if you guys have been studying, and I get the feeling that you have been, you've taken a second look at those neuron types. We had multipolar neurons, and we had bipolar neurons, and we had unipolar neurons. And I told you then that the sensory neurons tend to be the unipolar type. In other words, their cell bodies kind of set off to the side. So here we have that really long axon, and then the cell body kind of comes off at the side, and then the axon continues into the spinal cord. So there's a cluster of cell bodies here, and a cluster of cell bodies is called a ganglion. So part of the dorsal root is this ganglion of sensory neuron cell bodies. That is called the dorsal root ganglion. Brilliant nomenclature, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. The cell bodies that are the start of the motor neurons, and these are mostly the multipolar neurons where the cell body is at the end of the cell. These are going to be here in the spinal cord, and the color here is a little bit off, but you see that the central portion of the spinal cord is gray matter, lots and lots of cell bodies. And then the outer edges of the spinal cord, although it's colored yellow here, this is supposed to be white matter. And white matter is what? Myelin and myelinated axons, right? So we've got white matter out here. We've got a central core of gray matter, which is a lot of motor neuron cell bodies. And then the axons will come out through the ventral root. All right. Well, this illustration is actually intended to show us the 5 basic parts of a reflex arc. The anatomical structures that are going to be operating this unlearned, involuntary, rapid response to a stimulus. That the whole kind of structural setup is sometimes referred to as a reflex arc. So the first part of this is some sort of sensory receptor. This is almost always in the periphery. Now, we have lots of structures in our body that respond to different kinds of stimulus. So you have photoreceptors that respond to light. Where would we find the photoreceptors? In your eye, obviously. You don't see through your fingertips, you see through your eyes. We have receptors that respond to sound waves or vibrations. Where are we going to find those? In our ears. We have chemoreceptors that can respond or be activated by different types of chemicals. One place we find chemoreceptors is the taste buds in our mouth. And we have others that respond to airborne molecules that we're sniffing up through our nose. Right. You're right. You're quite right. Smell and taste are very closely linked. You really don't taste much if your nose is blocked up. You might have noticed last time you had a bad cold and your sinuses were all clogged up. Nothing really tasted right because you can't smell it. It really is. You can do the experiment at home yourself. We used to actually do this in the lab when we could let people eat in the lab. But what we would do is we'd get packages of lifesavers, like fruit-flavored lifesavers. And what you do is you block off your nose, and you put it works better if you don't know what the flavor is supposed to be. So you kind of close your eyes and you block your nose, and somebody sticks a lifesaver in your mouth, and you have to guess what flavor it is. And the error rate is enormous. You cannot tell the difference between cherry and lime. Most people got the pineapple because it's a little bit more acidic, so they could feel the burn. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to just play around with. What flavor is this? And they're like, I don't know. It's peppermint? No.
Don't try chocolate.
It's a waste of good chocolate. So we have chemoreceptors that respond to different kinds of chemicals. We have touch receptors that respond to light touch and deep pressure receptors, and receptors for heat and receptors for cold. And we have all kinds of sensory receptors out in the various parts of our body. So the first part of a reflex is going to involve some sort of sensation, some sort of activation of a sensory receptor. The sensory receptor is then going to be in communication with a sensory neuron. That's the second part. The sensory neuron is going to have action potentials because of the stimulus of the sensory receptor. And it's carrying those action potentials in toward the spinal cord. So this is sometimes referred to as the afferent neuron. It's carrying information, it's carrying stimuli, it is carrying action potentials in toward the spinal cord. So something activates a sensory receptor. And by the way, sensory receptors are pretty specific. So, for example, the photoreceptors that are in the retina of your eye will only send information about light into your brain. So if someone shines a light in your eye, your brain is getting that information that you have had light shine on you. By the way, what nerve is that? Optic nerve. And where in the brain does it go?
To the occipital lobe.
Occipital lobe. Very good. You guys did manage to hang on to some of what you learned last week. All right. Now, the thing about the point I'm trying to make is that other types of stimuli are still going to end up being interpreted by the nerves and by your central nervous system as if it was what that sensor is supposed to be responding to. So if you press on your eyes, put pressure on your eyes, what you're going to experience is light. Your brain is going to interpret those action potentials coming through your optic nerve as light. So you get punched in the face, you see stars. There is no light, it's just that's the way your brain is going to interpret those action potentials. So this is a fairly specific system. So the action potentials are going to come through the sensory neuron, up through the nerve, and then the sensory neurons branch off onto the dorsal root, pass through the dorsal root ganglion, and then come into the dorsal side of the spinal cord. Now this is where things get a little iffy. Some, but not all, of our reflexes have the third part. Which is called an interneuron. An interneuron is a neuron that is entirely within the spinal cord. Some of our reflexes have an interneuron. So the action potentials come up through the sensory neurons, through the dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion, come into the spinal cord, and then the sensory neuron forms a synapse on a shorty little neuron that's entirely within the spinal cord. This is the interneuron. Some of our reflexes have one, some of them don't. Now, if we have an interneuron, the interneuron will then form a synapse with the next component, which is the motor neuron. If we don't have an interneuron, the sensory neuron will synapse directly onto the motor neuron. We'll just skip over that, number 3. That's going to carry action potentials out of the spinal cord, back out into the periphery. And so this is sometimes called the efferent neuron. So action potentials will travel down the motor neuron through the ventral root, out through the spinal nerve, and out to some sort of organ or gland or structure or tissue that's out in the periphery somewhere, not part of the brain, not part of the spinal cord, like a muscle, like a gland. That part of the reflex arc is called the effector. So this might be skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, it could be some sort of gland, endocrine gland, exocrine gland. Something is going to happen. Something is going to change. These action potentials, these nerve stimuli, these signals are going to have an effect. And so these muscles or glands are called the effectors. Now, this is going to get a little easier when we do a specific example. One that I think everybody has some experience with. Because it's a fairly routine diagnostic test when you go in to have a physical exam. You've probably all had this done. They sat you down on a nice hard surface with your legs dangling down, and then somebody whacked you on the knee with a little rubber hammer. And what happens?
Your leg moves.
Your leg moves in which direction? Outward, right. It extends at the knee. We know this stuff now. All right. So this is what's called the patellar or knee jerk reflex. And it is a very good example of a spinal reflex. It demonstrates all the parts of the reflex arc, right? Now, the sensory receptors are actually up here in the quadriceps muscles. You guys remember the quadriceps? Rectus femoris, vastus medialis. Remember all these guys who are on the front of your femur, on the front of your thigh. The 4 biggies up there. Quadriceps muscle. Now, the sensory receptor that is being activated is a very interesting structure. It's a stretch receptor, also sometimes called a proprioreceptor. called a muscle spindle. Now these receptors are in fact skeletal muscle cells that have wrapped around them in a coil the endings of the sensory neurons. So the sensory neuron is just kind of wrapped around and around and around and around and around and around. It's coiled around these muscle fibers. When your muscle is relaxed or when it's contracted, these coils are fairly close together. But if you stretch the muscle, right, the coils get further apart. And the further apart they get, the more action potentials they generate. When your leg is in this position, the tendons for the quadriceps muscles cross over the patella, the kneecap, and attach themselves at the proximal end of the tibia on the tibial tuberosity. That's why there's that lump there, all right? When you're seated like this, there's a little bit of a gap between the patella and the tibia, where the tendon is stretched across, but there really isn't much behind it. So that's kind of the sweet spot. If you whack someone on the knee just below the kneecap and you push on the tendon, it's going to pull on those quadriceps muscles. That little bit of pressure is going to stretch the muscle. This is a little bit more elaborate picture, all right? So the stimulus is to hit that tendon, got to get the sweet spot. The quadriceps muscles are briefly stretched by the pressure on the tendon. Bursts of action potentials come from the muscle spindle stretch receptors and travel up the sensory neurons through the spinal nerves. When we get close to the spinal cord, the action potentials are going to go through the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion, and they're going to now synapse inside the spinal cord. So far, so good. Now, this particular reflex, the patellar or knee-jack reflex, is referred to as a monosynaptic reflex. Because it does not have an interneuron. Well, I'm exaggerating here. I'll get back to that in a second. So in reflexes where there is no interneuron, that is called a monosynaptic reflex. The sensory neurons are going to synapse directly onto the motor neurons. These are excitatory synapses. Oh, well, you know, it's an excitatory synapse. All right. So, action potentials that come through the sensory neurons are going to release neurotransmitters that will excite, make sure I got the right one, yeah, excite the motor neurons, and the motor neurons will carry those action potentials back out through the ventral root, back into the spinal nerve, down through the axons, and to the quadriceps muscles. The quadriceps are the effectors as well as the sensors. And the quadriceps are going to be excited to contract. oh, look at all the stuff we're pulling together here. The quadriceps muscles, all of them have the same action, which is to extend the lower leg at the knee. So the motor neurons excite the quadriceps muscles, and the quadriceps muscles contract, and the leg kicks out. You extend the lower leg at the knee. Yay, monosynaptic reflex. Really simple, right? If only. Because you can see there's more going on here. All right. But actually, to say this is a monosynaptic reflex is a little bit of an exaggeration. Yes, the sensory neuron synapses directly onto the motor neuron that is going to make the quadriceps contract. Cover your mouth when you do that, please. All right, but you'll notice that the sensory neuron actually forms a couple of branches here. One of these branches connects to or synapses on the motor neuron for the quadriceps muscles. But there's another branch here, and that is synapsing on an interneuron. And that interneuron forms a synapse onto the motor neurons that control the hamstring muscles. The hamstrings are those big muscles on the back of your femur, on the back of your thigh. The semimembranosus, the semitendinosus. What was the third one? What was the third one?
I don't remember.
Biceps femoris. Does that ring a bell? Yeah, I couldn't think of it right away either, but all right. It was in there somewhere. You just got to access the information. All right. So these neurons are communicating with the hamstring muscles. This is going to be an inhibitory synapse. So action potentials coming through the sensory neuron synapse onto the interneuron, and then the interneuron has an inhibitory synapse with the neurons that control the hamstrings. That's essentially going to shut down the hamstrings. They're not going to have action potentials. They're not going to contract. They're going to be forced to relax. Now, you've got the quadriceps on the front of the thigh, and you've got the hamstrings on the back of the thigh, and they have opposite effects. The quadriceps want to extend the lower leg at the knee. The hamstrings want to flex the lower leg at the knee. If you're going to have a coordinated response that doesn't involve broken bones, while one set is contracting, you pretty much have to relax the other. So the hamstrings are forced to relax while the quadriceps are contracting, and you get a nice smooth motion, a coordinated motion, rather than spasms, cramps, and broken bones. Snapped tendons, ligaments, it could be awful.
This is stuff is
Well, no, because we don't have because this is considered a monosynaptic reflex. There's no interneuron to the effectors, which are the quadriceps. So I skipped number 3. But then I went back, and now I do have a number 3, because I have an inhibitory interneuron. Okay, now this has gotten even more complicated.
So you did the numbering on purpose.
I did.
Oh, okay, okay.
This is the second time I've given this lecture this week, so I've got it a little bit better than just off the top of my head. All right. Now, if someone whacks you on the knee with a little rubber hammer, do you know it's happened?
Yes.
Of course you do. He's looking at me like, is there a trick to that question? No, there's no trick to that question. So, they don't show it here, but there is actually a third branch off of that sensory neuron. That is going to connect to neurons of the spinal cord that are going to carry the information that you've just been whacked on the knee with a little rubber hammer up through the spinal cord, into the brain stem, into the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is processing sensory information. It's editorializing. Do you need to know where your underwear is right this minute? No, you do not. I'm not going to worry you about that. Someone just whacked you on the knee with a little rubber hammer. The thalamus is going to say, well, I think you should know about that. So it's going to send that information up to your somatosensory cortex, the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe, and you are now aware, you perceive that you have been whacked on the knee with a little rubber hammer. Now, you remember that bundles of neurons, bundles of axons in the central nervous system are called tracts. So these action potentials are coming up through what are called ascending tracts. Thalamus says, yeah, you probably need to know somebody just hit you. And it goes on to the somatosensory cortex, where you become aware that something has happened. If you wish to take some additional action, like giggling, or cursing, or punching someone in the face because they just hit you on the knee with a little rubber hammer, all right? That is going to be initiated with the motor cortex, the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. After a little bit more processing, do I really want to punch this guy in the face? And then those action potentials will go down through descending tracts and out through the spinal nerves that control the muscles of making a fist and punching somebody or giggling, whatever you're going to do. These, of course, would be voluntary responses. These are not part of the reflex. But you do perceive that it has occurred through this third branch. Yes, sir.
Can you overcome said reflex?
No.
All right. I only asked because I remember growing up, my knee didn't always jerk when they hit it. Maybe they didn't hit the sweet spot.
Hit the sweet spot, yeah.
Sometimes it was only a little bit, but you know, like I felt like I was trying to. I knew what I was expecting, and I was trying not to do what they wanted me to do. So I wasn't sure if they hit it, and then it went up, and then I decided my voluntary action would be to not.
Now, you notice that I was very confident when I said, no, you can't stop it. Because we used to actually do a lab exercise in AMP1 where we would have people sit up on the tables and we would practice on each other. I've got a whole drawer full of little rubber hammers, right? And so we'd have people, do this in the lab. And I do a demonstration so that people would know about where to hit somebody and how hard to hit them, because you don't want to